Hello, this is Dr. Jennifer Ripley, and I will be presenting on the concept of factor analysis and internal consistency in this module. Hope that you enjoy it and that it helps you understand the material. So, what is a factor analysis? A factor analysis and a principal component analysis are two different statistical methods for the same purpose, and the purpose is to reduce data. It's essentially to try to take a lot of variables, a great number of things that were measured, and drown them down, pull them down into something that is just a few factors or components. Factor analysis, you call it a factor. Principal components analysis, you call it a component. But a lot of times when people talk about this stuff, they just talk about it as a factor, because factor analysis is kind of the umbrella term for everything in this area of study. But one thing to be aware of, and we do have a short clip on this in this series, is on confirmatory factor analysis. This is actually something quite different, even though it has the same name. It's actually testing a model of data to see if the underlying structure fits what you think or hypothesize it should be. So these are two very different things. Factor analysis is kind of like taking a bunch of data, lots and lots of variables, and throwing them up on a wall and seeing what sticks. Principal components analysis does a similar kind of thing. Confirmatory factor analysis essentially says this is where I think that this data should go, and then you throw it on the wall and you see how closely it lands to where you think it should land. So if that kind of gives you a big picture of what factor analysis is all about. So what is a factor? If you remember back to middle school and you had to factor numbers, and so you had the factors of 12, for instance, 1 times 12 makes 12, and 2 times 6 makes 12, and 3 times 4 makes 12, and so all of these numbers are factors of the number 12. It's essentially decomposing a number into its smaller parts. So there's a little bit of a similarity here, and factor analysis is taking all the little parts of data and trying to find some underlying structure or way in which they come together. So a couple of things that are really important concepts to understand in factor analysis is that you have the observable and the unobservable, right? So the observable is the thing that you measured. Like an IQ score would be an observable measure, right? So you could give someone an IQ test and you get a number, and that's their observable IQ score. But behind that is something hypothetical, unobservable, and underlying, and that is the concept of intelligence. Like, you hope that the intelligence quotient score is measuring their intelligence. We know as psychologists that there are a lot of problems with IQ testing and scores, and that it can be off by a good bit. For instance, if the person doesn't speak English very well, all of a sudden their IQ score becomes very questionable, and so that would add a lot of error to the idea. But what you want to make sure you understand is this idea that, like, you're measuring something, but you're actually not measuring the true thing. It's kind of like a cave and shadow thing if you had philosophy class. The true thing can never actually be accessed. We will never actually know what your intelligence actually is. Kind of only God knows that. But we as human beings, we live in the land of shadows, and we have to figure it out the best we can. And the best we have right now is an intelligence test. It's the same idea with psychopathic deviancy, for instance, in the MMPI. We can never really know what someone's psychopathic deviancy level really, truly, actually is. That is unobservable, but we can get their score, right? We can get their variable on that as a measured variable. So psychopathic deviancy or intelligence, those are factors that underlie. How would you actually ever use these things in factor analysis and any kind of psychological research? The primary and major use for this is to create psychological tests of variables. So for instance, if you wanted to make a personality test and try to measure type A and type B personality, then you would take the concept and you would develop items, and those things would be measured, right? And you're trying to measure the underlying factor of type A and type B personality, and then you would be looking for the underlying structure of all those questions that you asked. You could do the same thing with intelligence. Maybe you want to do a different kind of IQ test than the one we use, and use Gardner's multiple intelligences, and you think, this kinesthetic intelligence and social intelligence, spatial intelligence, all those things are really important. And so I'm going to break down and try to create a measure that would measure Gardner's multiple intelligences. So anyone who's developing a measure like that is going to be typically using factor analysis as their means to do it. A definition of what this is that a factor analysis is an analysis of the underlying factors. So here's an example. A psychologist wants to develop a scale to measure religious commitment, right? And so what you do is you think, okay, I want to develop this scale on religious commitment. What might be on that scale? Well, you know what? I'm not going to even just rely on myself. I'm going to be like a good researcher. I'm going to ask 15 different experts in religion to write down their ideas and create questions that might be measures of religious commitment, right, based on their expertise, previous research, that sort of thing, and the definition of the theory or the concept. So you now have something observable. That would be people's answers to their questions. Are you committed to your religious tradition? That would be a question. And people could answer that strongly agreed, strongly disagree, and you'd actually have an observable measurement, right? But it's pointing to an unobservable thing. Like, just because you ask someone what their religious commitment is doesn't mean you actually have a true measure of their actual religious commitment. Every measure has error and problems with it. So if I'm developing a scale, I'm going to take 100 students or maybe 300 students and have them answer all my questions that me and the 15 experts created. Maybe there's 50 questions about religious commitment, and I now have 100 people's answers to 50 questions, but I have 50 variables, right? So how do you possibly take 50 variables and boil them down so that you can have a good understanding of what religious commitment is? Well, that's where factor analysis can help you. So a factor analysis helps to identify, in PCA, it identifies the underlying dimensions that explain responses to our questionnaire. So our 50-question questionnaire. And then we can determine how many dimensions we might have. Maybe there's only one dimension and it's really one thing, religious commitment. But what if religious commitment is actually not one thing? Maybe it's actually 2 or 3 things. We call it religious commitment, but it actually breaks out into 2 or 3 separate constructs. So that's where principal components analysis can help us, is to figure out how many constructs we have. And we can then conduct an exploratory factor analysis so that we can try to uncover the structure of these large number of variables and boil them down into a small number of factors. So then the next step would be the researcher believes, based on this factor analysis, that maybe there are actually 2 dimensions of religious commitment. Like we found in this sample that a bunch of questions, and they all seem to be asking about religious behavior. And then we had a bunch of questions, and they all seem to be asking about religious attitudes. And they were really 2 separate dimensions. They kind of separated out as 2 separate constructs. And I want to confirm whether or not there actually are 2 separate constructs or not. If I'm doing that, then I am doing a confirmatory factor analysis to test and confirm if I actually have 2 structures, 2 constructs involved in measuring religious commitment. So I'm going to say, okay, based on previous research, these 6 items, we really think those are religious behavior based on previous research. These 4 items, we think those are religious attitudes. And we don't have any items that kind of are off by themselves, doing their own thing alone. We get a whole new sample of participants. Confirmatory factor analysis does have to be large. And you have 500 people, fill it out, and then you come to find out whether or not your structure fits from what you think. So those are the kind of 3 types of factor analysis as a quick introduction for you.